the Business Council of Car Cooperative and Mutual, Mr. Richard Thomas, and also Miss Linda Seaborn join us on Zoom. Welcome. Just before I proceed, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Chung Lu. I'm the chair of the committee. To my left is Deputy Chair Mr. Ryan Batchelor, Mr. Michael Gallia, Miss Demi Moya Deming, Dr. Matthew Bark, Dr. Sarah Mansfield, Mr. John McCracken, Dr. Renee Heath, and Mr. Ivy Puyali. Just like to read you all this information before we proceed. Regarding this, all evidence taken is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act 1975 and further subject to the provision of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during this hearing is protected by law. You're protected against any action for what you say during this hearing, but if you go elsewhere and repeat the same thing, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberate false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You'll provide a proof of version of the transcript following the hearing. The transcript will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee website. For Hansard record, I'd like to ask you to state your full name, organisation you're appealing on behalf of, please. If you could start from my right.
Don Holloway, YIMBY Melbourne.
Jonathan O'Brien, YIMBY Melbourne.
Richard Thomas, CHL.
And
Linda Seaborn, Business Council of Co-ops and Mutuals.
Thank you. Just due to time constraint, we have a session today. There will be no opening statement. We'll just move on straight to questioning. Again, members, I just want to remind you to remain to 5 minutes questioning. If I'd like to start, Mr. Batchelor.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I might start with the co-ops. Your submission talks about the need to review the regulation of community housing to ensure that the rental housing cooperative model is adequately looked at in the model. Can you just explain a bit more about the problem that you've identified and what you're seeking to address by the review?
Sure, yeah. So the housing cooperative sector that we see now was funded through a funding program in the 1980s and 90s that was specifically for housing cooperatives. And since then, we've been grouped in with the broader community housing sector. And so it's a bit of a one-size-fits-all criteria for assessing projects. And something that's different about housing cooperatives is they involve the people who are living in the housing cooperatives or going to live in the housing cooperative. So you actually need more time for that resident involvement, as opposed to if you're a developer who's not connected to the people who are going to live there, you can work on a much faster timeline because you can just make all the decisions. And so you don't have that inclusion. So for us to have that inclusion, we need a slower timeline.
Sorry, just to clarify there, so it's the key difference here is because effectively the owners or the occupiers who are engaged in the process, or rather than an external party.
So your target group is involved.
Okay.
Yeah. It also means we're more likely to do smaller developments. And it also means that sometimes we don't show up as providing support because we don't have partnerships with external support providers because the support is built inside the model. So by not having criteria that recognises the benefits of cooperatives, it looks like we're not providing the support when we're providing it in a different way.
Sure. Okay. Thanks very much. I might go to the YIMBY folk now. Clear in your submission that local councils are often the bad guys in stopping housing development. What do you think? Do you think there should be any consequences for councils who either by outright rejection or by elongation and delay frustrate the provision of more housing in their municipalities? Should there be consequences? What should they be?
So there's definitely be targets for local councils to meet in terms of building new supply, and there can definitely be sort of carrots and sticks to encourage councils to meet those targets. So like infrastructure spending, for example, might be conditional on meeting your housing targets.
We'd also want to see, for instance, councils recognizing the fact that they don't occupy silos. If one council underdelivers housing supply, it creates expenses for the rest of the market. All councils have a responsibility to the broader city, to the broader state, and the broader country to deliver housing supply, and we need an outcomes-driven system that recognizes that and enforces that for all councils and all planning authorities. That would include any state planning authority as well. Planning panels, those should also have outcome targets tied to them.
So what should happen, if this committee was to make a recommendation about what should happen to recalcitrant councils, what should it be?
Recalcitrant councils should either have their planning powers taken away entirely, that is one option, and moved to a state-based panel. Should they underdeliver targets, that would be sort of the first port of call, and is a port of call that has been put forth by a number of other academics, such as Peter Tulip.
One of the other interesting things in your report was the link between the structure of council wards and attitudes towards planning and development and a more conservative bias for single-member wards. What evidence do you have to back up that argument, and can you explain what the consequences of this is?
I'm not sure we made a comment on single-member wards specifically, but we did talk about the conservative biases of council. Single-member wards are, broadly speaking, less democratic.
I think that, it's hard for renters to get a say when they're a minority by a relatively small margin. They're about 30% of people in Melbourne, about, I think,
30%
rent. And when you have single-member wards, the homeowners, either with a mortgage or without, sort of have a majority there, and so they're able to get their voice heard more easily. And if you have a multi-member ward, then a group that represents sort of 30% of the population is more able to get representation at that council.
Yeah, in terms of the conservative bias, sort of beyond the single-member nature of the sort of forthcoming council election outcomes, the tools that councils have around planning are conservative. They are tools that are oriented towards saying no. They are tools that are oriented towards blocking and slowing development and delivery of housing stock. And these conservative tools are used by all parties, all sort of independents. Any councillor can use these conservative tools and have conservative outcomes, because if you use a conservative tool, you get a conservative outcome. And that is the toolkit that councils have today.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Mansfield?
Thank you. I might start with the housing cooperatives. I'm interested in, I guess, it might be helpful to explain what role you see cooperatives playing in addressing the housing affordability crisis that we're facing at the moment. How your model is, I guess, different to some of the other things we've heard about. I've been lucky to get to know the Northern Geelong Rental Housing Cooperative and go out and see what they're doing. But I'd like to hear from you, what role can they play in the sector?
Did you want to speak to that, Richard? Or
I'll speak to that. So essentially, the model itself works by the fact that, well, for example, we've been going for nearly 40 years, and it's a sustainable model. It's a longevity model. So the whole idea is, under our auspices, we have housing for life. So you come into the program and you are housed for life at different rental streams and different rental, depending on your salary and depending on your circumstances. That's the way that we treat the members of our co-ops. So essentially what it means is that you can enter at a very young age. Some of our co-op founders essentially are still part of the program, so they've been there for the full 40 years. And what it enables you to do is to have a reduced affordable rent through that period of your entire life, on the basis that there's a contribution back to the co-op, whether it be maintenance, whether it be a treasurer, whether it be the chair, but you make a contribution back which enables that rental to be kept low. It differs from other sectors, and obviously hearing the previous presentations, we obviously like it as a model. It's well supported. We've got over 2,000 people, 2,000 homes. We've got over 4,000 people in that program. And so it enables people to have that security of tenure, which a lot of renters don't have. And so if we can increase that, at the moment, it's only representative of about 1%. Internationally, you're looking at double figures easily in places like Sweden, Germany, France. And it's very important that the different models are identified. But like what Linda was saying, it's identifying those models that exist and have existed for some time. So it's not just we've done this in the last 5 years, we've been doing this for 40 years. And so essentially it works. We need to grow it though.
And what do you think's preventing it from growing?
I think obviously we benefit from the subsidies that we receive, but I think we obviously, like everybody, have increased overheads, the expense of development to bring on new stock for new members, and obviously we look as much as we can, and we do achieve and receive concessions in the way of land tax and receive GST. Obviously we're not for profit, so all of that we receive benefits from. But for example, if the real growth could come from, say, for example, a rates rebate, which is entertained, I believe, where Linda's from in Tasmania. So they're a little bit more progressive in that regard. But it's really just, in like the previous presentations, it's to do with that planning instrument as well. And even with these gentlemen sitting with me today, it's about that planning instrument that allows that growth, that has preferential treatment towards the provision of rental housing. But it's not the short-term rental housing, it's not the private investor rental housing. This is specific rental housing to communities.
Great, thank you. And I might go to YIMBY Melbourne now. I liked your comments about single-member wards, but I'll park those and just put out there that 120,000 permits have currently been approved by councils, but construction hasn't started yet. So we know that they're getting through them. We also know that they approve probably over 90% of planning applications. So I guess I'm just wondering about your thoughts on, the hold-ups being potentially beyond the council level and the planning system.
Sure. So there are two things there. The first is the number of permits that have been approved but not actioned. A large problem within the planning system is how long it takes those permits to get approved. So those permits are submitted at a given time when the economics of a development might make a bit more sense. We've obviously seen huge supply chain problems over the last sort of 24, 36 months since COVID that have significantly changed the economics of being able to develop. When applications are submitted, they're submitted on the proviso of a given economic context. When councils take, upwards of a year to accept a development permit, it changes the context in which those developments then exist and actually the feasibility of it. So speeding up council processes is really important. That's number one. Number two is that, yes, councils approve 90% of applications. That drops when you consider multi-residential applications, right? If you take all applications, yes, it's upwards of 90. But if you're looking at applications for multi-residentials, it actually drops down to sort of below 80% for some councils. So that's a 1 in 5 chance that you're going to get knocked back, which is significant. And there's not good data on how many of those acceptances are accepted with huge changes that would actually make the project unfeasible. There's not data on that. So that's really key there. And then the third point on that is that, yes, they're approving this rate, 4 out of 5, but that's only the applications that are made. The reality is that the current restrictions and the current perception of how permissive a council is going to be, whether a development is even going to be worth trying to submit, there are a whole bunch of restrictions that are causing a selection bias. We're seeing only the applications that are made, and the applications that are made are the ones that developers think they can get through, or any housing provider, a community housing provider, a cooperative housing provider thinks they can get through, and that biases the results there. And it's why we see a supply shortfall, even if we do see a high approval rate.
Thank you. Dr. Bath?
Thank you, and thank you both for being here with us. To the gentleman from YIMBY Melbourne, your ears may have been burning a little bit earlier, because when we were talking with both Peter Tulip and also the Grattan Institute, I think it was the team from Grattan, referenced the fact that you've just released a new report, Melbourne's
Correct.
Missing Middle. Now, given timelines, obviously, we haven't had a chance to have a look at that, but I'd love if you could please send a copy through to the committee.
Absolutely.
But then also, in particular, given that the Grattan Institute had referenced your very recent work that I'm not entirely across in a very approving way, would you mind just taking a minute to discuss with us your thesis there in your new report?
Sure. So there's a few things. It's a very comprehensive report. Our team put in an enormous amount of effort. We make 13 recommendations to government around improving housing supply and affordability and livability within Melbourne. Melbourne's Missing Middle, the core thesis is around upzoning around our transit corridors. So looking at our tram and tram network, that static infrastructure that we have, and going, right, we should probably put more homes around there. It's easier to run an additional tram every day than it is to sort of build an entirely new road network out to a greenfield area. We can reduce government spending per capita on infrastructure. We can actually make money through windfall gains and taxation there, and we can increase the tax base within the city. It's a revenue positive proposal that also allows more homes to be built where people want to live and enables a greener city, a city where more people are able to take active transport, to take public transport. It's a proposal that ultimately, pushes for better land use within our inner city, up to 6 stories around transit.
All right. Thank you very much. And again, if you wouldn't mind sending that through
Absolutely.
For us to consider a little more, that would be great. I was interested, Jonathan, in something you said. You said, a little earlier, use a conservative tool, get a conservative outcome. And then in your submission, you talked about a range of things, changing parking minimums, abolishing parking minimums, and you referred to other outdated planning requirements. What are some more of these outdated planning requirements that you argue are leading to these conservative outcomes?
For sure. Okay, yeah. So parking minimums are number one. That's another recommendation that we make within the report. It makes no sense to force people to pay for parking spaces that they don't use. A parking space costs $50,000 to $70,000. It adds that much onto an apartment's value, and it forces families. If you want to have a family-sized apartment, 3 bedrooms or more, most areas in Melbourne will force you to have 2 parking spaces. That forces families to pay up to $140,000 in parking for parking that they may not be using, may not want to use. It also induces demand. So it makes people think, oh, well, I guess I might as well have a car, right? When they might be otherwise able to make trade-offs, a cheaper apartment, no car, okay, but other transport options. So that's number one there. Other conservative tools that we have are the fact that most councils right now only have object buttons on their websites when it comes to developments, not support buttons. You show up to a council meeting. Really, we've been showing up to council meetings all across Melbourne, and the amount of shock that elected councillors and council officials have when we say, no, actually, I'm here in this meeting to say something positive, is really shocking to them. And, it's great that we're able to provide that voice. They're not used to it. They're used to having to field complaints, manage those complaints, and not hear the voice of the people who would like to live in a place but can't because there's no supply, there's nowhere for them to live, or because they can't afford it because of the market rate housing crisis that we are in right now. And, general housing crisis, of course, but specifically we're thinking about market rate there, but social housing is, of course, a huge part of our policy platform as well.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much. That's great. That's all from me, Chair. Thank you.
Michael, you like to proceed, please?
Thank you, Chair. Once again, I find myself having Dr. Bark asked my questions.
Sync today.
We are in sync today. I was going to actually also ask you about the Missing Middle report that you've both just released. I note that you use the example of a European city of Paris in terms of density, the first most dense hectare, the 50th to 100th, and how in Melbourne it goes from here to there very quickly, whereas in Paris it's much more steady. Do you think that the general perception amongst Victorians and probably Australians more generally is that when they hear density, they're picturing the big high-rises in the north of the CBD? And do you think that inhibits their willingness to accept better density in the suburbs?
Sure. A big part of what we're trying to do with our advocacy is create a positive vision of a denser city. It's why we refer to European cities like Vienna, like Amsterdam, like Berlin, like Paris. It's because these are desirable places that are dense, that have a dense fabric. And you're right, I think people, generally speaking, do not see towers as a good outcome, and I think people, generally speaking, do not see a suburban sprawl as a good outcome. But you're right, there aren't many examples, or there's not a large swathe of examples in Australia of this missing middle. But you go to our high streets, and a lot of our high streets have sort of 3 stories, you know, shops underneath, above shop living. We'd like to see that across more of our suburbs so that you don't just come off of the tramway and then immediately go into suburbia, but rather you come off our tramway and, oh, there's cafes 3rd Street, 4th Street, 5th Street. You know, one of the things we'd like to work on is a cafe index. How far do you have to walk to get to a good coffee in Melbourne? Because for a lot of people, it's not walking, it's driving. And yeah, we see exactly that missing middle is a missing middle in people's perception, and it's a missing middle in terms of home choices. You know, one of the things we would really like to enable through the provision of the missing middle and through the provision of broader density is the ability for cooperatives and whatnot to be able to actually finance and actually get housing diversity. We need more diverse forms of housing. There are people, you know, I'm sure you guys have a huge number of people who would love to be living in these configurations, but you guys can't finance it because of all these blockers, because of all these problems, right? Yes, there are supply chain problems, but we need to talk about in the room today the problems we can fix.
And you talk about briefly about lot consolidation in the report too. Obviously, it's not ideal to have a extreme ad hoc application of this sort of densification.
Certainly.
So how would you specifically propose that be addressed, and what's the model, I guess, for consolidating lots where there's willingness to do so by the...
Sure. So this is something that there really does need to be more research into, and we flagged that in the report that there does need to be more research. The reality is that a lot of these sort of older European cities, and this was sort of marked by Colleen Peterson of Ratio, they have bigger block sizes, so their fabric kind of ends up slightly different. But it also happens all the time here. A developer will come in and they will say to 3 different homeowners or a strata, hey, let me offer you 130% of your property value. I'll buy up all 3 of your properties, consolidate it, and build something here. One of the things that we think should be pursued by government is the idea that the government might want to come in and have a look at strategic lot consolidation, be it for the delivery of the provision of more pocket parks, more parks around where development is happening, block level development, kind of looking at this precinct level, neighborhood level planning, and delivering outcomes that, aren't, you're right, an uneven fabric, but actually sort of think about, okay, how do we make a communal backyard for everyone? The new Australian backyard should be a communal backyard, not a whole bunch of sort of individualized backyards. I think we need to look at the city as a shared space and the third spaces as desirable places to take your family.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ivy, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Ave here. Thank you for coming in or zooming in. I might begin with the Business Council for Cooperatives and Mutuals. From the perspective of your submission, I'm not sure this relates to short stays, who I should address this to, either Linda or Richard.
Just address it to both.
To both? Yeah, that's fine.
See who answers.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we've heard through the process of this inquiry and from some submissions, or many submissions, the impact that short stays are having on the community, particularly acutely in regional areas where they're trying to house workers, that lack of housing that is available in the area, and yet you've got a short stay property that's sitting vacant for a large chunk or most of the year. What changes would you see to tackle that issue and ensure that some of those short stays are coming back onto the rental market in the long term?
Yeah, Linda, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to?
I wouldn't mind having a crack at that, which is that, so the short stays, I mean, that really comes down to local government regulations, but we do think there does need to be housing for workforces. And again, this is where cooperatives are quite useful. So a lot of regional areas, they have land, more so than they do in the cities. And there are options to create cooperative housing that the workforce or the co-op members that move in and out of the housing and have that autonomy and say in their housing, which sort of illustrates the range of cooperatives, which relates to what the previous speaker was talking about. Those cities that have the really dense housing, they have high proportions of cooperatives that the members are part owners in. So when you have the shared common spaces in the more dense housing, or if you're in a rural area, you shared spaces as well. The cooperative model of ownership creates a mechanism for governance around the shared spaces so that you get better harmony. So when people think about good density, they think about getting on well with their neighbours. Cooperatives give you a mechanism for doing that. And when you move into atomised ownership, so a strata title, you don't have the governance mechanisms for governing those shared spaces. And that's where you get people who don't like living together, have no mechanism for problem solving. So if you want to have density, bringing people together in the urban areas, or ways of bringing people together around your workforces in the rural areas, this is where your cooperative model comes in, because it allows you to facilitate groups of people functioning together. As for the short stay accommodation, I mean, we flagged that as one of the contributors to housing shortage, and we probably should back off on short stays until the local workforces and the local residents are all housed.
What regulation would you see in order to ensure that we do back off on short stays?
Oh, well, you can, Hobart City Council, where I live, has increased the rates on short stay accommodation, treat it more like commercial housing.
Okay, and is that a position, the Hobart example, one that you would support?
While we have a housing crisis, while we have a shortage of housing for residents and workers, yes.
Okay, and in terms of who places that charge, you mentioned the local government example earlier, and yet we have a housing statement at the state level that would override those local government schemes that are independently sort of currently operating in parts of Victoria. Would you see that administered by local government or state government?
I think that's really a decision for government. I mean, our position is that the short stay accommodation is exacerbating the housing crisis at the moment, and that it should be discouraged until there's enough housing for everybody.
Okay. Anything to add, Richard?
The only thing I would add is that, as Linda has said, that we, particularly in the regional areas, we have quite a good level of stock available for future development. So we're not seeing we believe there is an impact there from short stay accommodation, but in terms of our long-term view, medium to long-term view, it would be that we would just consolidate the holdings that we have there. The only thing I would mention is that a lot of those local councils, those regional councils, have redundant land. And it's that redundant land that could be utilised to counter that short stay accommodation. But again, we're in this for the long haul. But so as a short-term measure, yes, there could be that prescriptive tax or something like that on the short stay accommodation.
Yeah, definitely hearing the difference between the short term and the long term, but in the short term, regulation being something that we're speaking about. Thank you. That's my time.
Thank you. Dr. Heath.
Thank you. I've got some questions for both of you. I might start with with you guys. Can anybody join a cooperative?
There are qualifications based mainly on income, and essentially that. But once you have joined and you've made that pre-qualification, if at an income state, if that income increases because you have joined at a lower income basis when you've been accepted into the program, if that changes, you're not then excluded. So the whole idea is that if you can build a counter, so what we have is we have people on low income or no income, but then you've got people also, our former chair, for example, is an architect, so she's earning a fairly good wage, but that supports and supplements those that don't. From an income generation point, a revenue point of view. So yes, anybody can, but there are certain pre-qualifications that you have to have before you can join. If I'd known about this when I was younger, I would have joined.
Wow. Yeah.
Because it's one of the best kept secrets in Victoria, possibly in Australia, of this concept that exists where you get housing for life.
Yeah. Why is it one of the best kept secrets? So, what are the other benefits?
Well, the benefits are essentially you've got security of tenure, for your whole life, and it's at a reduced rent or an affordable rent. And so what that enables you to do is to build the community that Linda's referred to.
Yeah.
So you're getting that benefit as well. You're not living necessarily on your own. You might have your own dwelling or home, but you're part of a community. So we're actually working on the moment on our new types of communities.
Yeah.
So, is it an over 55s? Is it LGBTQI plus communities? Is it youth? Is it, the essential key workers that Linda's also referred to? So there's all of these models that can be brought into play in a community co-op housing type arrangement. And that's why it is the best kept secret, but there's a lot of scope, and there should be a lot of appeal. And if this was widely advertised, we already are inundated, as Jonathan has said. But it would go to another level.
Yeah, wow. And you said that in your submission, I think that your goal is to have 10%
Yes.
of social housing in co-ops. Where do you sit now? What percentage?
So in the report, it sits at 3%,
3%.
but it's 1% nationally.
Right.
So we've got a lot of room to go.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned from the outset, you've got European countries and Northern Hemisphere countries that are well into the double digits.
Yeah.
And it's because that model works. The previous people that were sitting here, when you questioned about superannuation will actually be key for us, not from self-managed super funds, but from the institutional side, which is what the federal government's looking at the moment, as a supplement.
Right.
So they can't get the returns, the superannuation funds can't get the returns at the moment because they can't justify them. But if there's a supplement, which is, if it comes from HAF, that's great. But if a supplement was offered, then yes, we could achieve what the European or the Northern Hemisphere models can achieve.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And I'll just see if sorry about my ignorance, but who owns the homes?
So Common Equity Housing Limited is a public company. They own the homes,
Right.
but it's under a shareholding agreement with the actual members,
Right.
and that's the benefit of and that contribution that the members make.
And you talk about communities sort of coming together. Do you build in, or do you own homes in clusters?
Yes.
Right. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
So I mentioned the new ones that we have, but the current ones we have, there's a Polish community,
Yeah.
a Tamil community. There's various communities that we have that have come together over many years. So these have been together for 30 years. So they've been able to sustain these communities. But yes, the whole idea is that they aren't done in clusters. We are only Victoria-based, but when you've got 2,100 properties, you are certainly going to cluster, because it's better to cluster for maintenance and for maintaining those properties.
Right, yeah, thank you so much. Very interesting. For the YIMBYs, not to be confused with NIMBYs, which we've spoken about before. Yeah, that's right. I've got a question. I'm obviously from a regional area, and you were talking about how your model is to build into already built up areas, add a tram rather than adding the infrastructure. Do you think that that's got a time frame where that just won't work anymore?
What do you mean, sorry?
Like, could you outgrow the current infrastructure?
You would need to make infrastructure improvements as population grows, as we do now. What we know is that it is easier to upgrade and improve on existing infrastructure than it is to build new infrastructure out to new suburbs, because as the urban limit grows, the area that you're servicing actually increases. Whereas if you're building up in here, you're only playing within a certain geographical area. Now, that would be the same for a regional town. You can sprawl out and sort of start buying up farmland and turning it into housing, or you can have towns with sort of centers that are a little bit built up, 3 to 6 stories, that provisions new people to come into the town without sort of damaging a lot of the natural environment, which is of course the thing that takes people there, or the thing that makes those places special. So I see it as scaling out. I think you need to improve rail structure. You might need to build a new rail line, but that is a lot easier that within sort of a smaller area, be it contained to the city, be it contained to a given town, than artificially developing new suburbs and pushing people further and further away from where jobs, communities, schools already are.
Thank you. It's probably my time, is it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Good timing. Councillor Cracken.
Thank you. I'm jealous of Dr. Heath because she stole a lot of my questions. Thank you for that.
I'm glad I went first.
But my interest is also in the application of these sorts of ideas in regional areas. And some of the regional areas that I represent might only have a population of, 10,000 under. Do you see this sort of idea of densification working in areas that probably aren't used to the level of densification that you're talking about?
I think giving people the option is great. I think ultimately, if a town is seeing population growth, there are sustainable and unsustainable ways to do population growth. We have scarce amounts of sort of arable land. We have scarce amounts of resources. I think encouraging and enabling people to live near each other is a fundamental human good. Now, some people want to live sort of, on properties, ranches, sort of privately, but giving people the option to come together and to sort of have these regional centres via some level of density. Now, it might not be sort of broad swaths of 6, but it might be, future homes size, sort of 3-story kind of complexes. I see no issue. I'm sure there are some people out in every place who would love to live this way. It's about giving people options.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. Some of the challenges would be about changing the thinking of some.
That's the big challenge everywhere.
Of local governments, particularly, areas that probably aren't used to these sorts of ideas. And I guess if you can't change the thinking, or if it's very difficult to, how would you sort of suggest that it could be changed? I mean, would you have, changed all the height limits and the story limits in the planning scheme and those sort of things? Is that some of the changes that you think would help facilitate these sorts of changes outside of Metro Melbourne? Or I'll ask that as a first question.
Yes, I think absolutely. We'd want to see, broadly, we call within our missing middle report for the abolition of the neighbourhood residential zone, which is the zone that keeps you to sort of 1 to 2 properties per lot, detached houses. We see that as a very viable and good option. We don't think it makes a lot of sense for, enormous amounts of land across our state to be locked into that. I think changing, very slightly in the way that Auckland have to great success, changing neighbourhood residential zone up to general residential zone, which is 3 stories, and multi-residential dwellings, so the kind of place where future homes and other sort of medium density projects can be built. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that just enabling it to be an option, as sort of Brendan Coates of Grattan was saying earlier, you see people begin to make different trade-offs because they can make those trade-offs because there are more abundant choices.
And this isn't about banning single-family homes. It's about sort of just giving people more options, right?
Yeah,
100%.
I mean, part of my thinking as well, so I live in Ballarat, and Ballarat would probably be in some ways quite equivalent to this middle ground that you're talking about in terms of the density of population that currently exists. You could pick up that density and put it into any of the sort of middle suburbs in Melbourne, and it wouldn't be too dissimilar. Mm-hmm. And I guess the application for what you're talking about, therefore, would be equally as possible in some of the larger regional centres. Would that be a fair?
Yeah, we are YIMBY Melbourne, where we've got our hands full with 31 councils here. But there is no reason, all of the recommendations that we've made in the Melbourne Missing Middle report are fundamentally good ideas. They're ideas that we could transplant to... we could transplant those to most cities around Australia, and the Abundant Housing Network Australia, of which we are a founding member, would seek to transplant a lot of these ideas or very similar ideas around Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, Hobart, Ballarat.
I mean, my thinking around this is also that as urban sprawl continues to sprawl...
Regrettably, yes.
Yeah, I think it is regrettable, and to manage our population in such a way that it's not just all concentrated in parts of Melbourne.
For sure.
And that it can be spread a bit more equally across... I mean, the large regional areas, Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, Traralgon, Shepparton, and the other, less larger areas near them. I guess this application could also be put into those settings as well.
Absolutely.
Without too much difference, really.
Correct. That's a big part of how we've structured the missing middle report, is that we've done all the research. It's 11,000 words, 90-something sources, 13 recommendations. This is a report that we picked up and put in Ballarat. This is a report where the recommendations can be put in any state in Australia, and we will see fundamentally better planning and urban outcomes for all Australians.
I can't wait for you to send through the report then.
I will
Thank you.
send it through.
Thank you, Mr. Cracken. Just a few quick questions before we wrap this up. Quickly, Jonathan and Donald, in your submission, you mentioned heritage and neighbourhood character overlay are blunt tools. What do you suggest in rating this planning tool and how we improve, make it better?
For sure. So again, deferring to the missing middle, we made a lot of recommendations around heritage there. Part of the problem with heritage in terms of particularly renters and home affordability, let's pull in renters here, is that heritage preserves bad build quality. It preserves low quality of life for renters. Better renting, I believe Joel has spoken at this inquiry, their power struggles, renting in winter report, said that 90% of measured Victorian rentals had indoor temperatures below 18 degrees Celsius. That's the World Health Organization's recommended minimum indoor temperature. 90% of our rental stock are not hitting that. A large number of that are these single glazed terrace, heritage listed homes. We are creating a health crisis for renters via heritage. It's a big problem. What we would like to see in terms of a heritage reform would be thinking about what is heritage that has genuine public value. And how can we optimize that? How can we take heritage buildings and buildings that are beautiful or that we care about and turn them into places of civic engagement, places where people can come together and places that can be enjoyed. The Kathleen Symes Centre, for instance, in Carlton is a really great example of a community library centre that is an absolutely beautiful old building that would be a tragedy to lose. But the reason it's such a tragedy to lose is that everyone can use it. Everyone can engage with it. A large number of heritage overlays lock up architecture that no one can see, and we leave it to private landowners to maintain or indeed not maintain these buildings. One of the best ways to get out of a heritage overlay is to neglect a property until it's irredeemable. And equally, we have heritage overlays that, lay down on churches, and then those churches and their congregations can no longer afford the heritage compliant upkeep. They just want to build a new church. They just want to build a new place where their community can come together. The reality is that heritage has to be reformed to be done on an on-balance basis and on a basis that optimizes for public good, not for kind of the whims of heritage consultants who have a financial incentive to heritage list as many properties as they can, because that's how they manufacture clients.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just quite quick questions. Stamp duty reform, you indicated in your submission that it's an inhibitor. Briefly, can you just give us a brief outline your opinion like on stamp duty, and should we keep it? And
yeah, absolutely. Don will take this one.
Yeah, so we should get rid of stamp duty and replace it with a land value tax. We talked about that in a submission to another inquiry earlier in the year. In terms of how it's impacting, it's mainly an inhibitor in terms of how it stops people from being able to allocate housing efficiently. So people either buy, some people have jobs where they have to move frequently, and then they just have to pay more tax every time they move. They've got to pay stamp duty again. And if your household composition changes over time and your current housing is no longer suitable for you, then you have to move and you've got to pay this tax again. And so like a broad-based land value tax would be a much more equitable way to sort of get that revenue and get those sort of land rents.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, I think time caught up with us at the moment as well. So again, I thank you, panelists, for your generous time coming in today and give you submissions. And I think definitely some of your point will be taken very closely and leading us towards our submissions. You receive a copy of the transcript for review in about a week's time before published in the website. We'll now take a break for 45 minutes and recommence at 1:15. Thank you, Linda, Richard, Jonathan and Donald. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
The broadcast enhanced